Well, I want to welcome all of you who are a part of Pepperdine University's virtual Harbor. I'm Jim Martin. I'm Vice President of the Harding School of Theology in Memphis. And with us is Steve Cuss, author of Managing Leadership Anxiety. Some of you may have just heard his discussion just on chronic anxiety in general. Steve, I wonder if we could talk at this point about some of the things that are involved in chronic anxiety. I know ambiguity. Maybe we could talk some about the criticism that so many ministers, church leaders are dealing with. If you could just begin anywhere.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, chronic anxiety has two forms. There's a unique source of anxiety. Like each of us are wired a little bit differently. And so we're triggered by different things. So for those who caught that first talk we had, for me, people pleasing will forever be a nemesis. For other people, it might be like perfectionism is a nemesis. Those are the unique sources, and learning what they are and naming them concretely is really powerful. But then there's just universal sources that no matter how you're wired, if you're in one of these environments, you're going to be anxious. And I've actually identified, and I teach about 30 universal sources of anxiety, that if you're in any one of these 30, you'll be anxious. And what often happens, Jim, is someone will call me and they'll have a case. They'll say, hey, I had this elders meeting and here's what happened. And what I'm listening for as they tell the case is I'm listening to hear how many of the 30 sources of anxiety are at play. I'm yet to hear less than 7. I've not had a case yet where somebody, because what happens is once you're pretty spun up, then you reach out for help. And so let's just look at the last year. As I've looked at my own life as a lead pastor, and then as I've listened to a lot of pastors, ambiguity is actually one of the 30 sources. If you're in an ambiguous situation, you're going to be anxious. Very related to that, not knowing what to do and having to do something, that will make you anxious. In fact, we have college interns at our church, and we intentionally give them a ministry that they don't know how to lead to help them learn and notice to manage their anxiety. And then if we really want to be cruel, we actually make them form a team of people who know more than they do about whatever they're leading. So one of my interns, he built a prayer labyrinth for us. And he had to put an architect on his team and someone who's like a spiritual director. And Brendan didn't know any of this. And so for him to lead these people, because he's having to do something and he doesn't know what to do, helps him pay attention to his anxiety. Two, more scarcity is always going to make you anxious. If you're talking just purely grinding poverty, there's a low base anxiety there. But for pastors, like, can we make payroll? How's offering in COVID? That's a real thing.
Yeah.
Jim, I got to say, I think the number one thing I've heard, I'd be interested to hear what you think, but for me, the number one thing I've heard from pastors is criticism. That it's always been with us, but the last year it was like 4-fold or 5-fold. What's your take on that?
I hear the same thing, Steve. During the election, there was just so much, and some of that was directed at church leaders. I hear that about all things related to the pandemic, everything from mask or no mask to vaccine or no vaccine. And then some of this criticism is deeply personal. I mean, it's gone beyond a clash of ideas to judging motives in some cases, and just can be very hurtful.
And I think pastoral vocation is not the only vocation where you take your work extremely personally, but it's absolutely, we take our vocation so personally.
You're right.
And I think that is why criticism hurts us more. Like, I've tried to sort it out. I've been really hurt by criticism. And what's interesting, Jim, is when I was an associate pastor, it didn't bother me. And when I stepped into the lead role, it felt like people had 50-pound weights on their hands. And I think it's because I feel too responsible for the church as the lead pastor. And therefore, my identity is so deeply tied up in the well-being of the church. And the other thing I think, Jim, is like, sometimes I've wanted to say to my critics, like, oh, you think you think you can criticize what we've done? You should hear what we say about what we've done. Like,
Yeah,
it's not like we're sitting around saying, wow, we did that amazing. We're saying, oh, we blew that one. Or
that's exactly right.
yeah. And I think we covered it just in that brief video we did, but there is something unique about attending church that makes you think you know how to lead a church. Like I think doctors deal with this too. You go to the doctor and she gives you a diagnosis and you say, well, let me Google that. Boy, pastors, we get this all the time. And you're right, last year, it felt like everything got heightened. What family systems theory teaches is that anxiety is contagious in a group. And so our whole society was extremely anxious. And so people were just increasingly more and more reactive because they couldn't manage their own anxiety. And in systems theory, groups need a scapegoat to relieve themselves of their anxiety. It's very much like in the Old Testament. And unfortunately and tragically, too many pastors were the scapegoat of the group's anxiety. So I have a real passion to help pastors notice criticism coming at you, and then also the inner critic inside. We could dig into that, or I'll see kind of where you want to go.
Could you say a word about the inner critic? I find that very helpful for as I wrestle with anxiety.
I think the inner critic's fascinating. Like the inner critic is the voice that shows up when things didn't go the way you thought they should, or where you didn't do as good a job as you thought. Or anytime, I would say in the words of Paul, anytime you fall short. So, in the Bible, of course, we fall short of the glory of God. So there's plenty of room there for the inner critic. But I'm interested in just when you fall short of your own standard. And it starts to send these messages of doom. For me, the inner critic says, you should know better by now. Like, you should know better. And then it pretty quickly moves down just to identity. You're stupid. Like that would be one of the messages of my inner critic. You're stupid. And everybody knows you're stupid. Kind of that imposter syndrome. We all have different messages. So I think the first thing is to actually name it to somebody, like I just did. It takes bravery. But if you don't name it, which I believe is what the Bible is enjoying with confession, just as in a little side, Jim, I think, when we protested away from the Catholic Church with Martin Luther, we left confession behind. But boy, what a gift of freedom when done correctly. So I'm a big fan of finding someone who loves you, whether it's another pastor or a spouse or a friend, and actually confess what makes you anxious. And then you'll become less anxious, and confess what your inner critic says, and it'll have less power over you. So when you start to analyze the message in the inner critic, you start to discover that it's actually pressuring you to be like God. You must be perfect. You must always be there for people. You must always do it right. You must always know the answer. So suddenly you realize, wow, like all knowing, all present, all powerful, that's God's character. To me, it then becomes a really spiritual warfare issue where it reminds me of the tempter in the Garden of Eden, where the very first temptation, he's like, you can be like God. So I think our inner critic is putting us under pressure because it's trying to make us into God. And I think, therefore, the gospel has so much freedom for us when we learn over time to believe the voice of the gospel over the voice of our inner critic. So what I try to encourage people to do is name it and then write down the adjectives that describe it. You might need a friend to do that for you. Like we actually do this exercise in my groups, and you name your inner critic. Everyone else writes down the adjectives, and it's condemning, harsh, unforgiving. And then we open our Bibles together, and it's really powerful. Okay, what's the gospel? Well, God is forgiving. There's no condemnation for those in Christ Jesus. You see that the inner critic is actually completely competing with the good news of Jesus. And now it's a matter of the faith step to believe God over your own voice. So as I've done deeper work in my own life, I find it helpful to name the inner critics. And mine is called Milton because it's hard to take him seriously when his name is Milton. And then the other thing I realized, like Milton from the movie Office Space, I don't have to pay him anymore. Like he's going to keep showing up to work, but that doesn't mean I have to pay him. Doesn't mean I have to give him the corner office of my brain. So that intentional move to relegate Milton to the basement of my brain and let God be sovereign in the corner office. These are just some little hacks that I think can really help. Because when criticism comes at you from people, it definitely like co-mingles in this unholy alliance with your inner critic, and then it just floods you with shame, and it's genuinely damaging. If you sit in it, you're going to burn out. You can't stay in ministry living that way. So I'm a big fan of freedom and helping pastors encounter the gospel we teach others about. I think that's one of the most important things we can do as pastors.
Thank you for that. That's helpful. So we deal with these inner critics, but we also deal with these external critics, these flesh and blood critics.
Yeah.
And I've heard you kind of separate some of these out. Usual suspects. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Yeah, in some ways, all I do is I take like a big concept and I try to break it down into its pieces, because I find that we get overwhelmed. So when we talk about anxiety, that's too big a word. But if we can talk about the inner critic as one of like 100 different forms of anxiety, we have the power to do something. So I've done that with criticism. Criticism is a big word. Every pastor I know faces tremendous criticism. It's a tough job. So those of you who are watching, you are doing a difficult work. You're doing a really needed work. And I think what's most difficult is when you don't feel seen. You're working so hard for God, and maybe you're facing a lot of criticism. So what happens is that most churches have a subset of critics. I call them the usual suspects. So there's also helpful critics, and I shouldn't even call them critics, but because we take our work so personally, sometimes even great feedback feels like criticism. So I do want to say, before we get to the usual suspects, I have grown so much as a leader when I've opened my heart up to helpful feedback, people with helpful feedback. They love me. They love our church. They see something in me where I need to grow, or a blind spot. So I want to name that. And then you have your garden variety critics. That's kind of what we were talking about before. Like, they just think they know how to do it better, even though they've never done it before. They're actually somewhat harmless. Like, it hurts, but they're not predatory. But then you have the usual suspects, and you can always tell a usual suspect because no matter how often you meet, no matter what you say, no matter how much insight you provide and how hard you work, you will never win them over, ever. They have a vested interest in misunderstanding you. And a couple of signs that you're dealing with the usual suspect is a garden variety critic, which is the other categories. If they have an issue with you, and let's say you blew it, let's say you did it wrong, and you say to them, "You're right. I was wrong. You're right, and I was wrong." Your average garden variety critic will then dissolve the heat and move toward you. "Hey, man, no problem. We're all human. It really helped to talk. I feel better. Shake in peace," kind of idea. But a usual suspect will weaponize your vulnerability against you. That's one of the ways you know they're a usual suspect. They're not safe. So you really do have to treat them differently. I had the incredible privilege of living an hour from Rocky Mountain National Park, and the signs are everywhere. Don't feed the wildlife. And that's my message. Once you figure out a usual suspect, stop feeding them. Stop giving them your insight. Stop trying to resolve. Another sign is if they keep shifting the target on you. I bet most of us have had the meeting where someone just piles on. They just pile issue above issue. And you're kind of overwhelmed, and you say, "Okay, well, let's tackle them one at a time." And so you tackle the first one, and you're explaining what's going on. And as you're resolving, it's like they ricochet off it and they go to the next. "Oh yeah, but what about this?" They never allow resolution. They never say, "I understand now." And then the third sign that it's a usual suspect is when they are presented with clear, objective, factual evidence, but they stay in their own point of view. I'm not meaning to suggest that pastors are right and people are wrong. I mean, the majority of the people have this broad opinion about how things were, and the usual suspect says, "No, that's not how it was." I used to have a lady in our church in the early days. She would say, "How are you doing, Steve?" And I'd say, I'm fine." And she'd say, No, you're not." I'm like, "No, I'm well. Thanks for asking. I'm well." No. See, I've got the gift of discernment," she told me. "And God's told me you're not well. You're actually arrogant and full of pride." And I'm like, "Well, yeah, that's true too, but like that kind of comes with the territory." But it was this weird, like when somebody thinks they know your heart better than you know your heart, and when they're staying on their opinion, it's over. It's over. And so that was the moment for her. It was over. And by over, I don't mean she's leaving the church. I just mean she's not moving toward me. So now I'm always going to bring an elder to that meeting. I'm never going to meet with a usual suspect alone for a couple of reasons. One is bullies tend to behave better when there's an audience. But when you're alone with them, they can really do some damage. And secondly, if a usual suspect is in the habit of twisting your words, having a witness there is really helpful. So don't feed the wildlife. Stop trying to win them over. And the final thing I'll say, Jim, I know I'm going on a bit here, but it's really helped me just to figure out, okay, how many people in my organization, how many of them are usual suspects, and then what's the percentage? So in my church, we have around 2,000 people that would call our church home. I've got 6 usual suspects. I could name them for you now. Mm-hmm. So that's a very fractional percentage. But the amount of real estate they were taking in my brain until I did this work was absurd, just absurd. So just the idea that, wait a minute, this isn't even 1% of my congregation. It's less than 1%. Why am I giving them 25, 30% of my mental capacity? Why am I giving them so much time? So in the last several years, I've neglected my usual suspects, and they have had to learn to deal with my neglect, and it's been wonderful.
Okay, Steve, this has been so helpful.
Yeah.
And as we close, I'm just I'm mindful right now that you're talking to a lot of tired people, and I relate. I've heard you talk about life-giving habits, life-giving actions. I wonder if you could touch on that for a moment before we close.
Oh, great. Yeah, I'm glad you asked, Jim, because it's actually one of my favorite tools, and it's so simple. I just think pastors, we tend to think more as God's employee and less as God's child, and I think that can get us into trouble. And so I would just ask a question now to those of you watching. When I say the gifts of God, that phrase, the gifts of God, if you think more conduit than recipient, in other words, if you think more like the gift list in the New Testament, that God gave me a gift in order for me to serve others with, that's a spiritual gift. The life-giving list is a way to capture the gifts of God, where you are 100% the recipient and not the conduit. These are not gifts that God has given you to serve others and serve the kingdom. These are gifts that God has given you because you are God's beloved daughter or son. And so, yeah, there's a downloadable template. You can just get it from my website, or you can make your own. They're really simple. But it's simply an extensive list of the people and the places and the activities that make you feel human and alive, or they make you feel like a kid in God's kingdom. And I've got 87 things on my list. So that's a challenge for those of you who are competitive. Because what happens with anxiety is we lose our imagination. We kind of bear down. We try to push through. But life-giving list, you can pull it out when you're anxious, and you can pick a few things off the list in the moment. You can actually displace your anxiety with life-giving activities because they're gifts from God. And listen, on my list, it's as simple as eating 1 square of Lindt chocolate. But when I do it, I say, thank you, Jesus, for the gift of taste, that I find something delicious, like it's an act of worship. And it's as extensive as driving through Italy with my family, which I've had the pleasure of doing 1 time in my life, and I don't know if I'll ever get back, but it was so life-giving, it's on my list. So some things you have to budget for, some things you can do in the moment. You can start to see why I have 87 items. We have a puppy in our family, and he made it pretty quickly onto my life-giving list. He is so happy when I'm anxious because he gets so many walks. Just getting outside is on my life-giving list. Walking my dog, Brody, and talking to God. So those are often 3 things I do together. So, the traditional quiet time, that's on my life-giving list. So I would encourage anyone just to pause. It takes like half an hour to start. And just as we close, Jim, I'll also say, if you're married, have your spouse do it, and then do things on each other's list to serve each other. If you have kids, they can make it. And it just increases your ability to worship in the moment. Yeah.
Okay. Steve, thank you so much for being with us today. If people watching this want to connect with more of your writings or your work, I know you have a podcast. Could you say how do we get to where you are?
Yeah, you can find everything from my website, stevecusswords.com. You can grab my podcast, or you can just search the Managing Leadership Anxiety podcast. Yeah, and then I come and speak to groups. I do staff meetings. And then Capable Life, you mentioned, www.capablelife.me. It's an online community of resources for faith leaders. So that'd be the other place, but you can find it all at stevecusswords.com.
All right. Thank you so much for being with us today, Steve. Thank you.
Jim, thanks so much.